I have to take a moment to introduce our guest tonight because she's really very special. We've had her before. It's Joan Peters, historian, journalist. If you'll forgive me, the biography is so long and complex, I need to actually read from it. First off, she's the author of the prize-winning book, From Time Immemorial, The Origins of the Arab-Jewish Conflict Over Palestine. This is the book. It's in most bookstores, or they can order it, but it's it's a wonderful book. Don't start reading this when you go to bed. It's a page-turner. It's in current demand, used as a textbook in the United States and Israel. Ms. Peters served as a White House advisor on American foreign policy in the Middle East during the Carter administration, which was quite a time for that. She's lectured at the U.S. State Department, foreign policy institutions in the U.S. and abroad. She's conducted fact-finding missions to Israel, Syria, Egypt, and other areas, produced a series of CBS News documentaries about the wars in the Middle East, has acted as a foreign affairs correspondent on public television. She has contributed to Harper's, Commentary, The New Republic, The New Leader, and other periodicals. She is currently an advisor, trustee, and executive committee member of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, based in New York. Joan Peters, thank you for stopping by.
Oh, it's my pleasure, always.
Look, since your book came out, you're the middle of a lot of conflict and argument, debate, and the first subject we were talking before the program about George Orwell and his way back in 1948, his book where he introduced the term newspeak, and you've kind of taken that term and using it on the spin we're getting today with the situation in Israel and the Palestinians, and you call it turn-speak.
Yes, because it's different than newspeak.
Yeah.
Turn-speak is what has developed in the world as an excuse for an Arab case, because there is no Arab case for Israel. And the Arabs have literally stolen the identity of the Jews to create a case for themselves, and in so doing, they've created a turn-speak. They've turned everything on its head, and that's where my term came from, turn-speak.
You know, I let me reiterate this part of your history that I remember from when you were with us before. You went over there originally on the other side of the question. You went to defend the Arab position, to write something. You're a historian, you're a professional at digging out the real facts. And when you got there, you changed sides because you found a lot of turn-speak.
Yeah, well, it isn't so much that I changed sides. I was an old civil rights activist, and I had thought that the Arab refugees were in the same kind of plight that the African Americans had been as slaves and who were in the South.
Oh yeah,
and
they
it looked
sell
like
this,
a
yeah.
similar. It's a kind of similar packaging.
Yeah.
And I went to the camps in Lebanon, and I saw the differences from what I'd thought, and I realized that the Arab, well, there were so many layers upon layers, that it's quite scary, because that's how we've gotten this equal sort of, what do we call it? Is it a moral
Doctrine of equivalency? Yeah.
Moral equivalency.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like saying that Hitler was as equally guilty as the Jews, whom he burned to death, or he did whatever he did to. For some reason, there has been a blind spot in the world since 1948. Well, it's not some reason. It's because there's been a huge amount of very active blinding.
Yeah. You were going to read a passage
I would
in
love to.
Turn-speak. Yeah, this is fascinating the way
Yes, it's from my book, and it's in the conclusion, and it's after I've done an awful lot, 10 years of research and putting together, but I'll just read this one brief bit to you, and then I'll take it apart. All the myths surrounding the Arab Palestinians are based on the same premises. 1, the Palestinian people have had an identity with the land. Well, let's stop right there. First of all, the use of the term Palestinian people as being Arabs is an immediate public relations coup, because by calling them Palestinians, they immediately are identified with Palestine, and if they are identified with Palestine, then Israel is not. And if you say in 1948 Palestine became Israel, it appears that the Jews took over Palestine from the Arabs. But there were no Arab Palestinians. There never was an Arab Palestine. The only Arab Palestine that existed and exists is Jordan.
Yeah.
And the kingdom of Jordan became Palestine, but the king of Jordan, King Abdullah, was assassinated for saying that Jordan was Palestine, even though it's 75% of the entire Palestinian mandate. That's the first, very first part of this very short paragraph. The second, that identity, meaning the Palestinian Arab identity, has been present for, quote, thousands of years, unquote.
Yeah.
It has never been present. There has never been a Palestinian identity. In fact, the Arabs would not be called Palestinians.
No, they didn't want that term back when it was in 1948. They said, well, you're Palestinian. They said, no, the Jews are Palestinians.
Yes, they said we are Syrians, we are southern Syrians, we are anything but Palestinians.
Yeah.
We will call ourselves Ottomans, Turks, but don't call us Palestinians. The Palestinian brigade that the British was able to muster in the mandatory period and in the war was the Jewish brigade.
Yeah, they were Jewish soldiers.
Yes. Well, so much for the second one. 3. The alien Jews, quote, returned after 2,000 years, unquote, in 1948 to displace the Palestinian Arabs in the new Jewish state. Okay, well, that's a lot. The alien Jews, first of all, the Jews were not alien. Even the most hostile British reports that were available, like the Peel Commission report, which did actually trace Jewish history back in the Holy Land, all of them said that there's always been a Jewish presence in the Holy Land.
Yes.
And that the Jews never left.
How could the Jews be alien to Israel? There's the only country in the world that really is identified with the people, Israel and the Jews.
Exactly.
More so than we white European immigrants are with North America, say.
Well, it's exactly right. And it's hard to imagine, but that is what they're called now. You've seen the publicity as much as I have.
Yes.
You've seen the kind of handouts we get
yeah.
when we go to the State Department. You've seen how they call them alien.
Yeah.
And the Arabs are the natives.
The natives, yeah.
And we'll go on with that one. It's the alien Jews returned after 2,000 years in 1948 to displace the Palestinian Arabs. I will stop there. To displace the Palestinian Arabs, okay? The displaced persons in the Middle East were not the Arabs. They were the Jews.
Yes.
There were 900,000 or so who were forced to flee without their property from Arab countries in 1948. Nobody knows about the Jewish refugees.
Yes.
They are displaced.
They were chased out of Arab countries.
They were, for fear of their lives.
Yeah.
But the Arabs who are called refugees, and this started can I do a little bit of deviating from this?
Joan, you're free to say what you like on this program.
The idea of displacement of Arabs was one of the driving forces that started me on this book, because I thought they had been. And a number of things have suddenly become very clear in the process of writing this book. It wasn't so sudden, it was 10 years. But what was the first thing that ever happened, do you think? It was a slight definition change in the United Nations archives.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition change was so overwhelming that I didn't even pay attention to it the first time. The definition of a refugee in the world is that any person who has been forced to flee from their livelihood and their lands from time immemorial, who has lived there a long time, will in fact be qualifying as a refugee. Oh. They have long-lived status in the country they left.
Okay.
And in the case of 1948, the Arabs actually had a separate Arab refugee agency called UNRWA, just for Arab refugees from Israel, not from anywhere else. The rest of the world, and there were 50 million refugees who were created, the need was incredible after the Second World War, so that there were enormous numbers of refugees. They were all under the rubric of a World Refugee Organization except for the Arab refugees from Israel. They created a special agency. And in that agency, and in that definition, they changed the definition of refugee for Arab refugees from Israel to any person who had been in Israel 2 years before 1948.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, it suddenly came to me, and I went back to this definition change, and I thought, how could they do a definition change that was so United Nations oriented and had to be inclusive of so many thousands of people for it to happen, when in fact these people are long-lived natives from time immemorial.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out, going into the UN archives, that these Arab refugees, who were not called Palestinians at that time, the Arab refugees had indeed fled from other Arab countries to follow on the Jews' tail, to get the benefits, to get all of the varying qualities that were in the Jewish settlements that were not in Arab countries.
So, to wrap it up, the Arabs were not long-lived in Israel.
And they weren't displaced.
And they weren't displaced. The United Nations accommodated them by saying if you just have 2 years in the land, well, then you're a refugee from it, and accommodated Arabs that had almost just arrived with the Jews.
There's nothing wrong with that, you know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with an Arab wanting to better himself.
Not at all, but...
And a nomadic tribe is... we studied about nomads in high school. We know that there are wandering peoples in the desert.
Yes.
It's a very noble profession to
Yes,
wander
yes,
and
right.
find your land where you can and move on. But not when it's at the expense of a whole people. Not when they're about to steal the entire persona of the one Jewish country in the world.
Yeah. She's Joan Peters. She has so much to say. I hope we'll be able to get it said, but she's the author of From Time Immemorial. You really need to read the original. And she's what is called in the business source material. You know, in our newsletter we quote different, I don't know, Cal Thomas and Joseph Farah, different authors, Daniel Pipes and so on, who we rely on and trust and who are, they say things in editorials and we repeat them and we quote them, but they're not exactly source material. They, in turn, look at Joan Peters and people like her book, her research, her life's work to get their ideas. She is source material, and I'm glad we can bring her to you today. Back with her after this. You know, Israel's usually ahead of things, and Isaiah spoke about turn speak, Joan, 3,000 years ago almost. In Isaiah 5:20, he says, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil." Isn't that turn speak?
Wow.
These peace plans that we're seeing, people are persuaded by the roadmap. Evidently, our tours are getting larger, but what do you think about these oncoming peace plans?
Well, they're fine, except that there's only one party to them, and you can't have a peace plan for one party.
Yeah, that's right. The Israelis have done what they're supposed to under the roadmap, as far as I can see.
The roadmap is absolutely dead. It was dead before it started,
Okay.
because the fallacious premise of all the peace plans that have been proposed is that the Arabs are ready to make peace of some sort with Israel or accept it in some future date. And up until the present, and I believe into quite a long time in the future, until there's some reform of Islam, there will not be a possibility of a peace plan, because there have to be two parties who, in some way, agree to agree.
And it seems like almost propaganda to say there needs to be a Palestinian state in the middle of Israel. This will cause peace. You have any confidence in that?
Of course not. They don't want a Palestinian state in Israel. They want Israel. They want a Palestinian state wherever there is a Jewish land. And if it wasn't there, it would be wherever it was, the Arabs would want it. The Palestinians are an invention of the Arab League. The Palestinians did not exist. They are a wonderful group of human beings, just like any other group, before they got indoctrinated by their schools into hating and killing Jews. That was fine. But today, the Palestinians do have a land. Even if they don't deserve it, they have one. They have 3/4 of Palestine, called Jordan.
Yes.
And, you know, people have said, oh, Jordan will never accept this. But you know what? They aren't going to have a choice, because everything else is sort of being ruled out. And there is going to come a time when, if not more, there will at least be a federated state of the Palestinians, which will be inclusive of the East Bank and all of Jordan. And Israel will be able to retain this tiny piece of land in the world that it has. There is no other solution. Maybe when there is a reform of Islam in a couple of 100 years, and they separate the jihad or hate from the religion and from the politics of their people, maybe then there can be talk about having another state. But at that time, I don't think it'll be necessary, because they will no longer, Allah willing, they will no longer hate non-Islamists.
Well, the indoctrination is on the level of children in school books and so on. It's getting worse as we go, because these children grow up and become teenagers and suicide bombers and zealots of all sorts because of their early training.
Well,
Can something be done?
you know, there are many studies being done now, very expert studies that are taking the school books, they're taking the infant, literally infant indoctrination.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking the camps, the children's day camps of the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. Never mind Syria or Egypt or Lebanon or any of the Arab countries, because of course they all have the same training. Certainly Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the initiator. But the tiny children are being taught to hate, not just on an emotional level. They're taught to kill. And this is threatening the entire society that we live in.
Yeah, it's not just the Jews. It's Americans. It's the West. It's the free world.
Yes, and the Saudis are the greatest perpetrators of this. They have been paying the Palestinians to kill. They've been giving, now I think it's $50,000. I know Iraq gave money. Saudi Arabia has always given money. The Saudi Arabians, who are the most guilty of spreading hate against Americans and Jews, are the supposed best friends in the Arab world of us.
Yeah, why do they get a free pass? Why do they visit the president's ranch and the
Why?
White House?
Why is it that in Israel the terrorists are called militants? Why are they never called terrorists? Why are they terrorists everywhere else in the world where they kill? Everywhere, Malaysia, Indonesia, Syria, Egypt, the United States, they're terrorists.
Yes.
And yet the Palestinians, who are the terrorists in Israel, who have been killing the same way they're killing here, are called militants. They're given great status. They're given respect. Why are these murderers given respect in Israel and nowhere else? Does that mean that there's a special law for Jewish victims of terrorism?
It certainly sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it also gives one pause when one realizes that in the Iraq war, early on after we stopped the official fighting, even though we have a bigger war going on now, the Iraq war brought many what they called foreigners. Now, in the beginning of this Fedayeen war against Americans, about 2 months ago, it stopped. They were calling them Palestinian invaders. Then all of a sudden it stopped totally.
Mm-hmm.
They never referred to them by any name other than foreigners or invaders.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
We're protecting the Palestinians again.
Why?
That's
You tell me.
That's what I don't know. You know, it's almost a spiritual problem. If you want an answer like that, I can tell you it seems that the more distant people are from God, the more they hate Israel and the Jews and all the evidence of God at work in the world. And Islamists are pretty far from the real God as far as I can see it. That's a Christian view.
But the Palestinians are not really largely Islamists. They're haters, but they're terrorists on a different level.
You know, that's true. I don't find them very religious when I travel in Israel. There are mosques in the villages, but I don't think they're very well attended. Typically, there's a village of 10,000 people, say, and there's one minaret.
Right.
Small building. It won't hold the town. It won't hold 1/100th of a town. They're not very religious people as much as we hear from them about religion.
No, they've been bred to hate, Zola. They've been bred to hate, and it's very sad because they started out, you know, the 12-year-old Palestinian doesn't know that his family came from Sudan or from Egypt or from Lebanon, or that they didn't have the right to this country, that they are stealing the right from a people who has been shunted around from time immemorial. They don't know that. They are taught that their land is where the Jews are, and they want to kill the Jews. And this is what they're taught.
Now, this right of return, they're not only taught that, but they are taught that their families were chased out of Israel by the Jews, and now there are millions of them in the next generation and the next generation, and they have a right to return now to Israel. What's your take on that?
Well, that's got a lot. You have to hear some background
Yeah,
on that.
yeah.
That has to do with getting back to the myths and this one basic paragraph, because the right of return basically is the terminology of the Jews for their land after the Holocaust and after having been in pogroms and having lost the Jewish state when the Romans destroyed it. Mm-hmm. That has the right to return in context. The right to return, as the Arabs are using it now, is a complete robbery of the language and the ideas of the Jews. The right to return does not apply to Arabs because they have no right to the land the Jews are in. They never did own the land. They never did have a tradition on the land. They had no peoplehood. This is totally fabricated, and it must be understood that because it's a Jewish state, the Jewish state cannot be robbed of its heritage. That they say two rights and two with one state. It's not true. It has been fabricated. The Arabs' right is only to go to Jordan if they want to, or go and live in any one of the many millions of miles of territory that the Arab lands encompass in the Middle East. But the Arab League has used and abused these people. They've made them into human bombs. You know, when I wrote my book, I called them human bombs. I called them that virtually. I didn't mean that they were going to be real bombs. It never, in my wildest nightmares.
Oh, you wrote it a while back.
Yes, but they are human bombs, literally.
Yes.
And they've been created by the Arab world to mask the hatred against a Jewish state in their midst. And now, it's not just in their midst, it's in America, because they've got the Saudis egging them on. It's all about inciting. And these Palestinians have been incited into a belief that they can only be happy and get an identity, which they never wanted, by the way. Mm-hmm. According to D.H. Lawrence, they never wanted an identity. But they want it because the world has made them want it. And that's the sadness.
You mean T.E. Lawrence, I think. Lawrence of Arabia, is that who you're referring to?
Yes, did I say D.H.? Oh,
yeah.
God.
That's okay. No, I know what you're referring to. He found them hard to make into a people also.
Well, he found it impossible, but he said one very important thing. He said, it's a good thing that there are no natural resources in the Arab world, lest I would find it very troubling to try and build them into a force. Huh. And then came the oil.
And they've had all the natural. Well, the Europeans seem to support it, and the British. Even over to Malaysia, you get all this anti-Semitism and implication that the Palestinians deserve the land, etc. What do you make of this? These are civilized people, supposedly.
The rife hatred of Jews, Semites, Jews, in the world has been revved up. I'm not sure what's the biggest force behind it, but I can tell you that I was doing research for 10 years. I saw a lot of anti-Semitism in the books of pages of history. Mm-hmm. I never saw anything the likes of what's happening today, not even in Hitler's day.
It's spread out so far now.
I wonder if the pendulum will swing so far and then come back the other way, because I can't believe, I don't want to sound like Anne Frank or Pollyanna, but I can't believe that people in the media, that people like me, people like you, who are still indoctrinated by the phony handouts that the State Department gives, or the textbooks that are wrong, I can't believe that somewhere along the way they're not going to say, whoa, There's something wrong here. They have to believe that something's wrong along the way.
Something's wrong here, Joan, and that is we're out of time. It's so fascinating to talk to you. The time goes by like
Yeah.
like nothing, and it's time that we wrap up. But thanks for coming, and I want you to stay for a second program, and we'll show that one next week and
Okay.
go on with this discussion. She's Joan Peters. What can I say? She's source material. She understands the entire situation. I may sound biased and so on. Maybe I am biased, but she is a researcher who has gone there, done the work, found the facts, and is here to relate them to you. You know, Scripture pertains in some ways to what's going on today. In Psalm 83, there is a single verse that says in Psalm 83:4, "They have said, 'Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance.'" That's your area, isn't it, Joan?
Wow. That's absolutely on target.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's a little scary.
It's scary,
In
yeah.
fact.
Yeah. It says, "For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up thy head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones." That's just what's going on.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
How can that be?
Yeah. The psalmist lived 3,000 years ago, but he saw the truth. Look, we're at a time when Israel is in trouble all around the world, and it's part of your daily work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Zionism's been called racism. What do you make of that, by the way? Zionism is racism.
It's about the Jewish state.
Yeah.
There's one set of rules for the Jewish state and another set of rules for all other states. There can't be a national liberation movement if it's Jewish. There can be a Palestinian Arab liberation movement, even if it's not real, even if it was invented. But there can't be, the campuses don't allow a thing taught like, in the main, there are no such courses. The national liberation of the Jewish people, the national liberation of Israel,
Yeah, why isn't there an
the modern state of Israel. Why isn't there a course of that?
How about they would find that Israel's one of the world's most progressive countries and doing very, very well. Why isn't there an ILO to match the PLO? An Israel Liberation Organization.
But Israel is the ILO. Israel was there long before the PLO.
Oh, that's true.
And the PLO is simply, not so simply, but, well, maybe it is simple. It was implanted there in order to destroy Israel.
You know, I was going to ask you about this illegal immigration. Is that what's meant by the Arabs coming across borders and settling and so forth?
Good question. Illegal immigration by the British was meant Jews. As far as the British were concerned, there were no illegal Arab immigrants. There were only Jewish illegal immigrants who were a nuisance to the British because they were trying to come from Hitler's Germany, where they were being slaughtered, and the British wouldn't allow them in the mandatory period because they would be an affront to the British and to the Arabs.
Yeah, this was in the 1940s.
30s, 20s, 30s.
Even back to then. Every time the Jews came, the British would shut them out.
Well, miserable little Jewish refugee ships were being shot at who were approaching Palestine's borders, and the coasts were clear, but they couldn't get in because the British commissioner, the British High Commissioner, had promised certain Arab offendees and Arab inciting to violence that if they let the Jews in, there would be more violence. There was no nationalism at that time. There was none. There was only what is an age-old hatred of the non-Muslim, the infidel, and that could be incited readily.
Mm-hmm.
All it needed was a mufti. The Grand Mufti of the area was, in
Islamic
fact,
leader.
yeah, he was, but he was, in fact, inciting hate blindly. It had nothing to do with either politics or Israel.
And we're seeing it really come to fruition. Finally, the British gave up. The Jews did come in. They reestablished their country, and
Well,
now...
they didn't give up for quite a long while. In the meantime, there were thousands upon thousands of Jews who were not allowed into their own homeland which had been mandated to them in the I would say 1920 was the correct date. That was when the mandatory period began. There was an international mandate for a Jewish national home. That meant Israel. And that was supposed to begin in 1920. The Balfour Declaration merely underscored that. But the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the mandate, giving the Jews international a force of power as a state. What happened was that the British honored this mandate in the breach. They called Arabs natives, they called Jews interlopers, they called them intruders, they called them aliens. In fact, they were importing secretly thousands upon thousands of Arabs to Israel, to Palestine, from areas all over the Arab world, and saying that the places were not there for Jews. They said that the absorptive capacity for Jews had been reached in the country, that they had been granted, so that it was so perverted and so distorted going in that by the time 1948 came, it was a continuation of perversion, of immorality. It wasn't the beginning. The Jews must come out and fight for their people and for their country. They fight for everything. The Igbos, the Koreans, the blacks, the
Whales.
Chinese, they fight for everything. They are they're in touch with human rights everywhere, but they are blinded in their own land.
That is a phenomenon I've noticed. If Israel, say tourism, depended on American Jewish people to come, I think they'd go out of business.
That's right.
It's sad. But the church people are coming, the so-called Christian Zionists. People that watch our program certainly come to Israel readily, even in the worst of times, and I'm rather
and
proud
I'm sure
of them.
they are very, very grateful for that.
Yeah.
I'm sure that they are.
Look, campus is a place where it starts. I myself am in the middle. I'm embroiled with a campus that subverted a speaking engagement of mine, so that when I finally stood before the audience, there were only 2 students from the university that came, even though we sent plenty of publicity and we're ready to send plenty more. People from a local church poured in, but as for students, I asked for a show of hands. There were 2, and then I learned they needed the assembly credits. They suffered through that and got stamped on the way out and never come back. But you've been speaking on campuses more than I have.
Well, I was, but lately they have been canceling me. They have canceled everything that is Zionist or pro-Zionist or pro-Israeli. And, well, you saw what happened in Canada with Benjamin Netanyahu. I was in that same city a week earlier, and I got to speak at a school, but it was only a matter of pure luck. If Netanyahu had happened first, it wouldn't have happened.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm getting calls from everywhere in the world to come and speak. You wouldn't believe where. One thing that I didn't get to tell you is that my book is coming out in Norwegian, if you can believe
My
that,
goodness, yeah.
in the beginning of November.
I had a book come out in Norwegian, couldn't read a word of it. I guess it was my book.
I can't. In fact, I had somebody check it, the whole translation.
Make sure it's all
I
there.
did.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful person I found in Israel
Yeah.
to do that. She was a Norwegian Jew who lived in Israel.
Mhm.
And she's very good. Her name is Jackie Feinberg, just in case you want to give a little hello
blog.
and thank you. But I must say that I've had calls from Dublin. I've had calls from Ames, Iowa. I've had calls from Fresno, California.
They want to hear your
from
point
Sydney,
of
Australia.
Yeah.
They need, it isn't a matter of wanting. They sound so desperate. They are so upset. They say there's no balance. There are film after film against Jews, against Israel, but they have no, what they say is, we need to hear the other side.
Sure.
And I say, what's the other side? They say the side about Israel and Jews and their rights. I said, what side are you hearing now? Well, we're hearing about all the rights of the Arabs. And you know, Zola, it is so obscene to me to hear that campuses have been stolen by the lies of the Arab world and the hatred, that our very campuses, the bastions of intellectual freedom and curiosity are being taken over by something so fascistic as this. I really balk at it, and I don't know what we can do, but we have to do something, because both of us have been very badly beaten by this.
Yes.
And it's hate. It's pure, unadulterated hate. It has to be tempered, and we can't allow a Hitlerian kind of fascism to take over the campuses, because to give equal time to the lies of Arabs about Palestine and to the Jewish history of their land and how they got it and how they're keeping it in spite of all of the terror, that is tantamount to giving Hitler equal time with the Jews who were walked to their deaths in the ovens.
You know, I devoted my past summer to driving through the Midwest with a trailer with my wife and going from attempting to go from campus to campus. We publicized this. We contacted people in college towns. They went to the colleges. We mailed videotape of what I was going to say ahead, no surprises. We got almost no takers. I could commend the Pittsburgh State University in Kansas that had me, or Governor's State in Chicago. Usually it was the work of one good guy on campus who made it happen, but frankly, I almost wasted the time. And I did it without fee, without travel expense, simply saying, would you like to hear the other side of the story? Nobody. But forget about this diversity. Forget about this all voices welcome. There's no such thing on our campuses. They are Muslim institutions.
Yeah, they are. And it's very sad.
It's terribly sad. Look, we have to go to a break just momentarily, but yeah, I hate to give that report, and I did so in the Levitt letter, but it was an utter failure in the sense of talking to student bodies, because nobody came but church people. The universities did the best they could to suppress the speeches, and Joan has had plenty of experiences. We're going to go to a break right now. She's Joan Peters. She's source material. She wrote from time immemorial. You want the truth, get it here. Back with her right after this. We're hearing so much propaganda about the place. You were reading last week from your from time immemorial. Give me another selection out of this turn speak you were calling.
Yes, right.
How they distort.
Yes. Well, what we're hearing, what I really want to do is just read one sentence that sounds very factual and simple and correct, and then take it apart and show how many elements of it are false and deceitful and lies.
Okay, yeah.
I'll do this one. Only Jews immigrated into Palestine, while Arabs were natives there for millennia. It's just the opposite.
It is, yeah.
It's just the opposite. The Arabs had, in my book, I trace the Arab communities that came following in upon the Jewish settlers who first came to resettle Israel in the end of the 19th century. They had what they called ketuvim. The Jews wrote their sort of letters to their people at home, and they called them ketuvim, and they would describe how 10 Arabs would come, and then a whole tribe would end up coming and planting themselves at the foot of a settlement that had just developed, and beginning to try to get the benefits that were accruing to the Jews who had moved in there. And it was a rough territory, so they couldn't stay there very long. They moved on, and another group came. And the Ottoman ruler of the time were charging them usurious interest rates in order to stay on the land for a season. And they would charge up to 120% interest for a loan that they gave to keep them there in order to pay the tolls. They had to pay head tax to the Turkish.
Yeah.
The Turkish head tax was collected by the Arab effendis who were absentee. The owners of this land were not in the land where the Jews and the Arabs were. They were in Lebanon. They were in Syria. They were simply cashing in on this flow of people. But there was a constant exchange of people. And the Turks were bringing in people from other countries within the Turkish Empire. For example, Bosnia. There are many Bosnians who are considered now Palestinians.
Oh, I heard of this. Yeah, somebody in Israel told me, "My gosh, we have Pakistanis here, we have Iranians here, we have everybody in the Middle East just walks over the borders, and then they call themselves Palestinians."
I have a list here. But
Sure,
did you
sure it
know?
would be.
Can't find it.
Oh.
It's a list of all the nationalities that called themselves native in Jerusalem.
Well, how many approximately?
Oh, maybe 50.
50 different nationalities.
50, yes, but I mean all over the world. The interesting thing is that there's so many layers of deceit. They start in so many different places. You can't go from one to another without talking about the deceit. You have to cut through. You have to break this incredible mythology that has created the anti-Semitism against Israel. You must. It's very important to do it.
Yes. Oh my gosh, it's important, yeah. Well, today, of course, the problem of the moment is these homicide bombings against the Jews that the so-called Palestinians keep perpetrating. And as we sit today, there's much talk about building this fence or trying to fence the Jewish settlements away from the Palestinian homicide bombers. And recently the UN declared, well, that's just a terrible thing and they can't do it and so forth. Can they seriously say to people, do not protect yourself against murderers? I mean, that's what they're saying.
They might seriously say it, but I hope that the Israelis won't accept it. Would the Americans accept it?
Gosh,
I ask you,
wow.
would we build a fence to keep out homicide bombers, or would we get rid of them? Would we keep them out at any cost? What would we do? I can't imagine us building makeshift fences to protect our children because we couldn't protect them any other way. But that's what the Jews are up against.
Why can't the Jews do what we do, which is to go in the areas and arrest the people? I mean, they do.
Yeah, it's not just Jews. I said Jews, but excuse me for interrupting, but it's Jews and Christians and others who are not Muslim.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here.
Oh, yeah.
It's not simply Jews who live in the Jewish state. There are many others who live also.
No, immigrants to Israel of all sorts, visitors and so forth, are all exposed to these homicide bombs.
Yes.
What is the complaint about the fence? What's wrong with it? I mean, you hate to do it, but given that, is there something terribly wrong about fencing off murderers?
Well, of course not. But the murderers don't want to be fenced off, do they?
No, I don't think so.
And since they have the final say in world opinion, in the court of world opinion, everything seems to go. I just wonder, you were talking about this, the pendulum.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how many hundreds of thousands more innocent people in Israel are going to have to be slaughtered before the pendulum swings the other way. Is it going to be a Holocaust?
Yeah, we were discussing that. Yeah, whether the pendulum has swung too far. I mean, here the Prime Minister of Malaysia criticized Jewish people because they're Jews, rather like Hitler. People everywhere, campuses, newspapers, the New York Times notably.
Militants instead of terrorists.
Yeah, this kind of talk.
Giving them respectability for murdering.
Yeah. Maybe the pendulum will go too far up one side, start back the other way, and people start saying, no, wait a minute, that's unreasonable. The Jews haven't done anything really to anybody, and so forth. And that's the question, when, and then Bible prophecy, if this is the time of the end, says it's not going to stop, it's going to lead all the way to Armageddon, where the whole world's going to attack Israel. And then they're going to lose, by the way, according to prophecy. But that's the end of all this. This is the famous Armageddon. Do you think this is building to a final cataclysm like that, or is it going to swing back? You have the wisdom to.
I don't have prophecy. I pray with all my heart that isn't what happens. I pray that there's a pendulum that swings back.
Yeah.
It's already too late to have swung back with humaneness, because if people were humane, they couldn't have let this go on as long as it has. I think there's something about, you want me to tell you what I think?
Sure.
I think that it's a kind of vengeance against the Jews for having been victimized in the Holocaust. I think the Jews have now been put into a position where people can say, you see, you're not such good guys after all. you did something bad to the Arabs. They have manufactured this whole case against the Jews, knowing that people have been looking for some way, something, to give them an excuse for what they let happen
To justify the whole
in the Second World War.
It's very interesting. Guilt causes you to say, well, you deserved it.
I believe so. I can't think of any other reason that even approaches sanity. You know, if it's insane, then you simply say again, like Hitler did in the Second World War, you know, Jews are vermin, therefore, you know, they look like rats, we have to kill them and get rid of them. Then that's insane, and you can't go anywhere else but to what you spoke of. But if there's any sanity at all, maybe, although it's much too late to think of it as humane, maybe there can be an attempt to backtrack, to look at the evil that has been done, if no other reason than 9/11, the debacle.
Very good point. We ourselves have been attacked. Why?
How can we not identify with the Israelis in a time like this? How can they allow the world to blame the Jews for 9/11? Explain that to me, because you are the man of the cloth. I am not. I want to know how that could be perpetrated. Do you know that most of the world believes that this was done by the Mossad and that Jews were sent home from the World Trade Center?
Mm-hmm. Now, most of these stories have circulated, despite the
How crazy is that?
Lists of casualties in the New York Times with
Was
hundreds of
Jewish.
Jewish names. As a man of the cloth, I'll just say this. I hold Israel totally blameless, totally innocent. I don't see, not as a Jew and not as a guy who goes there a lot, etc., but just as a normal thinking human being, I do not see that they have done anything at all wrong. They are as tender and careful with Arab people as they can be. When they go and get a murderer, just like we do, they criticize, but they use the smallest missile, soldiers on their feet, taking casualties, trying to spare civilians. You get up to here with it, and you almost say, let's get this intifada so-called over with. It will take 5 minutes. You know, and the Israelis are like that. They are moral, they are decent, their law precludes...
They get absolutely no recognition for that.
No,
They're
absolutely
simply
none.
twisted into a devil image. Nothing they do, no humane act that they've compiled in this. I have a huge, I can't tell you how many pages I have loaded with things that the Israelis have done which are unknown to man because they're so humane.
Yeah, I have to stop you. And I want to save time to tell
over?
people to read this. It's over. Isn't that a wonderful conversation? From Time Immemorial is her book, The Origins of the Arab-Jewish Conflict over Palestine.